all, I think what Afghanistan does to an even greater degree than most defense issues is to boil down to a value judgment on how much cost you're willing to accept to reduce risk to any of our nations by how much. For my case, I draw the value judgment to say that it is in fact worth trying to secure our stakes in this conflict. But I think reasonable people can differ on that. Let me unpack why I think on the analytic merits, stakes and costs are a fairly close call here. There are two primary stakes, especially from an American standpoint, but for the NATO alliance generally in Afghanistan, and they're the two that the Obama administration has articulated. That Afghanistan not be a base for striking the West, and that Afghanistan not be a base for destabilizing its neighbors, and especially Pakistan. Of those two stakes, the first is the one that's the most talked about. Whether or not, if we fail in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden will once again set up a terrorist base camp in Afghanistan from which attacks could be launched on the United States or other NATO allies. Of the two, however, the second, in my view, is the more persuasive. Obviously, Afghanistan can be a base for attacking the United States. It was in 2001. One could imagine that happening again if the Karzai government were to collapse. But so could lots of other places. So could Somalia. So could Yemen. So could Djibouti. So could a variety of locations in the Caucasus or elsewhere. If our strategy for dealing with potential havens from which Osama bin Laden could operate is that we're going to deploy 8 combat brigades and 100,000 American and 40,000 other allied soldiers, we are going to run out of brigades a long time before Osama bin Laden runs out of havens. This strikes me as an unviable, larger strategy for dealing with the problem of al-Qaeda. But whereas there's nothing literally unique about Afghanistan as a base for striking the West, Afghanistan is geographically unique as a base for striking Pakistan. It's immediately across a notably porous border in the form of the Durand Line. The Pashtun ethnic group, which is central to the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan, is a cross-border group whose members in Pakistan greatly outnumber their members in Afghanistan. Pakistan, moreover, unlike Afghanistan, is the current base of al-Qaeda Global. It is also an unstable state currently engaged in a fairly intense internal civil war, which by many definitions isn't going terribly well for the state. And last, and certainly not least, it is an actual, real, live, as of right now, today, nuclear weapons state. The stability of whose nuclear weapons arsenal is dependent on the capacity of the Pakistani state to secure it. If the Pakistani counterinsurgency were to fail and the state were to collapse, this would constitute one of the very few scenarios that I think is remotely plausible by which Osama bin Laden could actually get his hands on a usable nuclear weapon. The stability of the Pakistani state and its ability to avert collapse and the breach of containment of its nuclear arsenal into the hands of a notably virulent terrorist group based within its own borders strikes me as a national security concern of the very first order, not just for the United States, but for the entire alliance. Now, if the more persuasive reason to care about Afghanistan is its effect on its neighbor Pakistan, why not do what the Vice President, for example, has prominently suggested and spend our money, our effort, our lives, and our resources on the other side of the Durand Line and deal with the Pakistani problem directly? And if someone has an approach for doing that that is plausibly likely to produce success, the address of the Secretary of State is Foggy Bottom, Washington, D.C. Please let her know immediately. I can't think of one. The United States has provided massive foreign aid to Pakistan. That aid has routinely been diverted to purposes other than those which we intend. And I think there's significant reason to suppose that it would not be put, to the degree we would like, into the conduct of effective counterinsurgency against internal militants within Pakistan's borders. I suspect that clever Pakistanis will be able to divert those resources regardless of attempts we might make to constrain their ability to use it, especially given our very limited visibility into the way our funds are used in Pakistan. We are not going to dispatch 100,000 ground troops to assist the Pakistani government in the conduct of counterinsurgency in their borders. A handful of trainers is considered so controversial that it has to be kept as quiet as possible. We are politically radioactive in Pakistan. That approach isn't likely to succeed. I could tick further down the list, but the general theme is I'm not terribly impressed with any of the direct options for dealing with the Pakistani security problem from an American or a NATO perspective. It seems to me that what we have in Pakistan is a tremendously important problem that we have very little ability to make very much better through direct policy. Given that, it seems to me that in many ways the right approach to strategy in this region is invoke the Hippocratic Oath and at least do no harm. And it seems to me that one of the more impressive opportunities we enjoy for doing quite a bit of harm in Pakistan is to fail in the counterinsurgency project on the other side of the Durand Line. If the Karzai government were to collapse and be replaced in all likelihood by chaos and civil warfare, there's some chance of a neo-Taliban restoration. I think the likelier outcome is a condition of chronic warfare and anarchy. That would enable a variety of militant groups that have cross-border aspirations to set up havens, training areas, and base camps in Afghanistan that would threaten the stability of Pakistan. We spend a great deal of time in the West talking about the threat that Pakistani base camps pose to success in counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. I worry a great deal more about movement in the other direction. If, in fact, we were to fail in Afghanistan and the government were to collapse, I think Afghanistan would be a serious aggravator of an already very dangerous situation in Pakistan. We therefore, in my view, do have important national security stakes at risk, specifically in Afghanistan. Note, however, that these are not unlimited. We could succeed at great cost and at great sacrifice in Afghanistan, and if the Pakistanis fail to put their own house in order and conduct their own counterinsurgency well, even without the aggravating factor of instability on their border, they could still fail. The Pakistani state could still collapse, and we could end up with the worst case anyway. Conversely, even if we were to fail in counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, if the Pakistanis do put their house in order and utilize the potential resources of the Pakistani state to resolve their internal stability problem, perhaps the problem of instability in Pakistan could be resolved even with instability on their border. What the project in Afghanistan does, it seems to me, is to reduce the odds of success in a terribly important undertaking in Pakistan, but it does not guarantee the outcome either for better or for worse. So I think what we have are important interests, but they're indirect rather than direct, and they're one among several influences on the outcome of what we care about the most, which is the security of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal in a state in which al-Qaeda is located. That, it seems to me, creates a substantial national security interest, but not one of obviously transcendent magnitude. And that, I think, puts us into a situation in which the benefits and the costs of waging this war are the close call that I suggested earlier. And it boils down to the value judgment of how much of a risk are you willing to run that failure in Afghanistan causes a cascade of several intervening events resulting eventually perhaps in the acquisition of a usable nuclear weapon by Osama bin Laden. As a voter, I think it's a close call, but one that I'm willing to take. I suspect that for most presidents, the risk of being judged if events break badly as having made what historians in retrospect, if it comes out that way, would surely judge as the worst foreign policy blunder of the modern era, weighs more heavily than it does on me. Either way, I think either of two diametrically opposite positions on Afghanistan are therefore defensible. One is make a serious effort to try and stabilize the country. The other is to conclude that the costs exceed the benefits, and as a result, we should disinvest and withdraw altogether. I'm skeptical about the merits of positions in between, but I think either of the two polar opposites are cases that one can defend.